Rant reading: A Serial Killer. H. H. Holmes. Herman Webster Mudgett, May 16, 1861 to May 7, 1896, better known as Dr. Henry Howard Holmes, or H. H. Holmes, was an American con artist and serial killer, the subject of more than 50 lawsuits in Chicago alone. Until his execution in 1896, he chose a career of crime, including insurance fraud, swindling, check forging, 3 to 4 bimonnious illegal marriages, murder, and horse theft. Despite his confession of 27 murders, including some people who were verifiably still alive while awaiting execution, Holmes was convicted and sentenced to death for only one murder, that of an accomplice and business partner, Benjamin Pitzel. It is believed he killed 3 of the Pitzel children as well as 3 mistresses, the child of one of the said mistresses and the sister of another. Holmes was executed on May 7, 1896, 9 days before his 35th birthday. Much of the lore surrounding the murder castle, along with many of his alleged crimes, are considered likely exaggerated or fabricated for sensationalistic tabloid pieces. Many of these factual inaccuracies have persisted due to the combination of ineffective police investigation and hyperbolic tabloid journalism, which are often cited as historical record. Holmes gave various contradictory accounts of his life, initially claiming innocence and later that he was possessed by Satan. His propensity for lying has made it difficult for researchers to ascertain the truth on the bias of his statements. Since the 1990s, Holmes has often been described as a serial killer. However, Adam Zeller points out in his book on Holmes, just killing several people isn't necessarily enough for most definitions of a serial killer. More often, it has to be a series of similar crimes committed over a period of time, usually more to satisfy a psychological urge on the killer's part than any more practical motive. And the murderers we can connect him, Holmes, that generally had a clear motive. Someone knew too much or was getting in his way. It couldn't be trusted. The murderers were simply for the love of bloodshed, but not a necessary part of furthering his swindling operations and protecting his lifestyle. Early life. Holmes was born as Herman Webster Mudgett in Gilmanton, New Hampshire on May 16, 1861, to Levi Horton Mudgett and Deodat Page Price, both of whom were descended from the first English immigrants in the area. Mudgett was his parents' third-born child. He had an older sister, Ellen, an older brother, Arthur, a younger brother, Henry, and a younger sister, Mary. Holmes' father was from a farming family, and at times he worked as a farmer, trader, and a house painter. His parents were devout Methodists. Later attempts to fit Holmes into the pattern seen in modern serial killers have described him torturing animals and suffering from abuse at the hands of a violent father. But contemporary and eyewitness accounts of his childhood do not provide proof of either. At the age of 16, Holmes graduated from Phillips Exeter Academy and took teaching jobs in Gilmanton and later in nearby Alton. On July 4, 1878, he married Clara Lovering in Alton. Their son, Robert Lovering Mudgett, was born on February 3, 1880, in London, New Hampshire. Robert became a certified public accountant and served as a city manager of Orlando, Florida. Holmes enrolled in the University of Vermont in Burlington at age 18, but was dissatisfied with the school and left after 1 year. In 1882, he entered the University of Michigan's Department of Medicine and Surgery and graduated in June 1884 after passing his exams. While enrolled, he worked in the anatomy lab under Professor William James Herman, then the chief anatomy director, and the two were said to have been engaged in facilitating grave robbing to supply medical cadavers. Holmes had apprenticed in New Hampshire under Num White, a noted advocate of human dissection. Years later, when Holmes was suspected of murder and claimed to be nothing but an insurance fraudster, he admitted to using cadavers to defraud life insurance companies several times in college. Housemates described Holmes as treating Clara violently, and in 1884, before his graduation, she moved back to New Hampshire, and later wrote she knew little of him afterwards. After he moved to Moores Forks, New York, a rumor spread that Holmes had been seen with a little boy who later disappeared. Holmes claimed the boy went back to his home in Massachusetts. No investigation took place, and Holmes quickly left town. He later traveled to Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, and got a job as a keeper at Norristown State Hospital, but quit after a few days. He later took a position at a drugstore in Philadelphia, but while he was working there, a boy died after taking medicine that was purchased at the store. Holmes denied any involvement in the child's death and immediately left the city. Right before moving to Chicago, he changed his name to Henry Howard Holmes to avoid the possibility of being exposed by victims of his previous scams. In his confession after his arrest, Holmes claimed he had killed his former medical schoolmate Robert Leacock in 1886 for insurance money. Leacock, however, died in Waterford, Ontario, in Canada on October 5, 1889. In late 1886, while still married to Clara, Holmes married Martha Bellenkamp. And in Minneapolis, Minnesota, he filed for divorce from Clara a few weeks after marrying Myrta, alleging infidelity on her part. The claims could not be proven and the suit went nowhere. Surviving paperwork indicated she probably was even informed of the suit. In any case, the divorce was never finalized. It was dismissed on June 4th, 1891 on the grounds of want of prosecution. Holmes had a daughter with Myrta, Lucy Theodot Holmes, who was born on July 4th, 1889 in Englewood, Chicago, Illinois. Lucy became a public school teacher. Holmes lived with Myrta and Lucy in Wilmette, Illinois, and spent most of his time in Chicago tending to business. Holmes married Georgina Yoke on January 17, 1894 in Denver, Colorado, while still married to both Clara and Martha, Illinois, and the murder castle. Holmes arrived in Chicago in August 1886, which is when he began using the name H. H. Holmes. He came across Elizabeth S. Holton's drugstore at the northeast corner of South Wallace Avenue and West 63rd Street in Englewood. Holton gave Holmes a job, and he proved to be a hard-working employee, eventually buying the store. Although several books portray Holton's husband as an old man who quickly vanished along with his wife, Dr. Holton was a fellow Michigan alumni, only a few years older than Holmes, and both Holtons remained in Englewood throughout Holmes's life and survived well into the 20th century. It is a myth that they were killed by Holmes. Likewise, Holmes did not kill alleged castle victim Miss Kate Durkee, who turned out to be very much alive. Holmes purchased an empty lot across from the drugstore where construction began in 1887 for a two-story mixed-use building, with apartments on the second floor and retail spaces, including a new drugstore. A creditor of Holmes named John Delbruley died of apoplexy on April 17, 1891 in the drugstore. When Holmes declined to pay the architects or the steel company, Etna Iron and Steel, they sued in 1888. In 1892, he added a third floor, telling investors and suppliers he intended to use it as a hotel during the upcoming World's Columbian Exposition. Though the hotel portion was never completed, in 1892 the hotel was somewhat completed with 3 stories and a basement. The ground floor was the storefront. Fictionalized accounts report that Holmes constructed the hotel to lure in tourists visiting the nearby World's Fair in order to murder them and sell their skeletons to medical schools. There is no evidence that Holmes ever tried to lure strangers into his hotel to murder them. In fact, none of his likely victims were strangers. Holmes did have a history of selling cadavers to medical schools. However, he acquired his wares through grave robbing rather than murder. Reports by the Yellow Press labeled the building as Holmes's murder castle, claiming the structure contained secret torture chambers, trapdoors, gas chambers, and a basement crematorium. None of these claims were true. Other accounts claim that the hotel was made up of over 100 rooms and laid out like a maze, with doors opening into brick walls, windowless rooms, and dead-end staircases. In reality, the hotel floor was moderately sized and largely unremarkable. It did not contain some hidden rooms, but they were used for hiding furniture Holmes bought on credit and did not intend to pay for. The hotel was gutted by a fire started by an unknown arsonist shortly after Holmes was arrested, but was largely rebuilt and used as a post office until 1938. Besides his infamous murder castle, Holmes also had a 1-story factory, which he claimed was to be used for glass bending. It is clear if the factory furnace was ever used for glass bending, it is speculated to have been used to destroy incriminating evidence of Holmes's crimes. Early victims. One of Holmes's early victims was his mistress, Julia Smith. She was the wife of Ned Connor, who had moved into Holmes's building and began working at his pharmacy jewelry counter. After Connor found out about Smith's affair with Holmes, he quit his job and moved away, leaving Smith with her daughter Pearl behind. Smythe gained custody of Pearl and remained at the hotel, continuing her relationship with Holmes. Julia and Pearl disappeared on Christmas Eve of 1891, and Holmes later claimed she had died during an abortion. Despite his medical background, Holmes was unlikely to be experienced in carrying out abortions, and mortality from such a procedure was high at that time. Holmes claimed to have poisoned Pearl, likely to hide the circumstances of her mother's death. A partial skeleton, possibly of a child around Pearl's age, was found when excavating Holmes's cellar. Pearl's father, Ned, was a key witness at Holmes's trial in Chicago. Emmeline Singrad began working in the building in May 1892 and disappeared that December. Rumors following her disappearance claimed she had gotten pregnant by Holmes, possibly being a victim of another failed abortion that Holmes tried to cover up. Another young girl who had worked for Holmes in this building, named Emily Van Tassel, vanished too. While working in the chemical bank building on Dearborn Street, Holmes met and became close friends with Benjamin Pitzel, a carpenter with a criminal past who was exhibiting the same building. A coal bin he had invented, Holmes used Pitzel as his right-hand man for several crime schemes. A district attorney later described Pitzel as Holmes' tool, his creature. In early 1893, a one-time actress named Minnie Williams moved to Chicago. Holmes claimed to have met her in an employment office, though there were rumors he had met her in Boston years earlier. He offered her a job at the hotel as his personal stenographer, and she accepted. Holmes persuaded Williams to transfer the deed to her property in Fort Worth, Texas, to a man named Alexander Bond, an alias of Holmes. In April 1893, Williams transferred the deed, with Holmes serving as the notary. Holmes later signed the deed over to Pitzel, giving him the alias Benton T. Lehman. The next month, Holmes and Williams, presenting themselves as husband and wife, rented an apartment in Chicago's Lincoln Park. Minnie's sister, Annie, came to visit, and in July, she wrote to her aunt that she planned to accompany brother Harry to Europe. Neither Minnie nor Annie were seen alive after July 5, 1893. Although not proven, Holmes was suspected of killing 6 other persons who vanished between 1891 and 1895. Dr. Ressler, who had an office in the castle, went missing in 1892. Kitty Kelly, a stenographer from Holmes, also went missing in 1892. John D. Davis of Greenfield, Pennsylvania, went to visit the 1893 World's Fair and vanished. In 1920, his daughter asked that he be declared legally dead. Henry Walker of Greensburg, Indiana, who went missing in November 1893, was alleged to have insured his life to Holmes for $20,000 and wrote to friends that he was working for Holmes in Chicago. Milford Cole of Baltimore, Maryland, was alleged to have disappeared after receiving a telegram from Holmes to come to Chicago in July 1894. An otherwise unknown victim was a Lucy Burbank. Her bank book was found in the castle in 1895. Pitzel murders. With insurance companies pressing to prosecute him for arson, Holmes left Chicago in July 1894. He reappeared in Fort Worth, where he had inherited property from the Williams sisters at the intersection of modern-day Commerce Street and 2nd Street. Here he once again attempted to build an incomplete structure without paying his suppliers and contractors. This building was not a site of any additional killings. In July 1894, Holmes was arrested and briefly jailed for the first time on the charge of selling monotone goods in St. Louis, Missouri. He was promptly bailed out. While in jail, he struck up a conversation with the convicted outlaw named Marion Hedgepeth, who was serving a 25-year sentence. Holmes had concocted a plan to swindle an insurance company out of $10,000 by taking out a policy on himself and then faking his death. Holmes promised Hedgepeth a $500 commission in exchange for the name of a lawyer who could be trusted. Holmes was directed to a St. Louis attorney named Jethro Howe. Howe thought Holmes' scheme was brilliant and agreed to play a part. Nevertheless, Holmes' plan to fake his own death failed. When the insurance company became suspicious and refused to pay, Holmes did not press the claim. Instead, he concocted a similar plan with Pitzel. Pitzel agreed to fake his own debt so that his wife could collect on $10,000 life insurance policy, which she was to split with Holmes and Howe. The scheme, which was to take place in Philadelphia, called for Pitzel to set himself up as an inventor under the name B.F. Perry, and then be killed and disfigured in a lab explosion. Holmes was to find an appropriate cadaver to play the role of Pitzel. Instead, Holmes killed Pitzel by knocking him unconscious with chloroform and setting his body on fire with the use of benzene. In his confession, Holmes implied Pitzel was still alive after he used the chloroform on him before he set him on fire. However, forensic evidence presented at Holmes' later trial showed chloroform had been administered after Pitzel's death, a fact of which the insurance company was unaware, presumably to fake suicide to exonerate Holmes should he be charged with murder. Holmes collected the insurance payout on the basis of the genuine Pitzel corpse. Holmes then went on to manipulate Pitzel's unsuspecting wife into allowing 3 of her 5 children, Alice, Nellie, and Howard, to be placed in his custody. The eldest daughter and the baby remained with Mrs. Pitzel. Holmes and the 3 Pitzel children traveled throughout the northern United States and into Canada. Simultaneously, he escorted Mrs. Pitzel along a parallel route, all the while using various aliases and lying to Mrs. Pitzel concerning her husband's death, claiming Pitzel was hiding in London, as well as lying to her about the true whereabouts of her 3 missing children in Detroit. Just before entering Canada, they were only separated by a few blocks. In an even more audacious move, Holmes was staying at another location with his wife, who was unaware of the whole affair. Holmes later confessed to murdering Alice and Nellie by forcing them into a large trunk and locking them inside. He drilled a hole in the lid of the trunk and put one end of a hose through the hole, attaching the other end to a gas line to asphyxiate the girls. Holmes buried their nude bodies in the cellar of his rental house at 16 St. Vincent Street in Toronto. This home and address no longer exist, St. Vincent Street having long since been realigned into a part of Bay Street. Frank Geyer, a Philadelphia police detective assigned to investigate Holmes and find the 3 missing children, found the decomposed bodies of the 2 Pitzel girls in the cellar of the Toronto home. Detective Geyer wrote, "The deeper we dug, the more horrible the odor became, and we reached the depth of 3 feet. We discovered what appeared to be the bone of the forearm of a human being." Geyer then went to Indianapolis, where Holmes had rented a cottage. Holmes was reported to have visited a local pharmacy to purchase the drugs which he used to kill young Howard Pitzel, and a repair shop to sharpen the knives he used to chop the body before he burned it. The boy's teeth and bits of bones were discovered in the home's chimney. Capture, arrest, trial, and execution. Holmes' murder spree finally ended when he was arrested in Boston on November 17, 1894. After being tracked from Philadelphia by the private Pinkerton National Detective Agency, he was held on an outstanding warrant for horse theft in Texas because the authorities had become more suspicious at this point, and Holmes appeared poised to flee the country in the company of his unsuspecting 3rd wife. In July 1895, following the discovery of Alice and Nellie's bodies, Chicago police and reporters began investigating his home building in Inglewood, known locally referred to as the Castle. Though many sensational claims were made, no evidence was found which could have convicted Holmes in Chicago. According to Salazar, stories of torture equipment found in the building are 20th century fiction. In October 1895, Holmes was put on trial for the murder of Benjamin Pitzel and was found guilty and sentenced to death. By then it was evident Holmes had also murdered the 3 missing Pitzel children. Following his conviction, Holmes was confessed to 27 murders in Chicago, Indianapolis, and Toronto. Though some people he confessed to murdering were still alive, in 6 attempted murders, Holmes was paid $7,500 by the Hearst newspapers in exchange for his confession, which was quickly found to be mostly nonsense. While writing his confession in prison, Holmes mentioned how drastically his facial appearance had changed since his imprisonment. On May 7, 1896, Holmes was hanged at Mayofin Prison, also known as the Philadelphia County Prison, for the murder of Pitzel. Until the moment of his death, Holmes remained calm and admirable, showing very few signs of fear, anxiety, or depression. Despite this, he asked for his coffin to be contained in cement and buried 10 feet deep because he was concerned grave robbers would steal his body and use it for dissection. Holmes's neck did not break. He instead strangled to death slowly, twitching for over 15 minutes before being pronounced dead 20 minutes after the trap had been sprung. Upon his execution, Holmes's body was interred in an unmarked grave at Holy Cross Cemetery, a Catholic cemetery in the Philadelphia western suburb of Eden, Pennsylvania. On New Year's Eve, 1909, Hedgepeth, who had been pardoned for informing on Holmes, was shot and killed by police officer Edward Gerbrack during a holdup at a Chicago saloon. On March 7, 1914, the Chicago Tribune reported that the death of Patrick Quinlan, the former caretaker of the castle, the mysteries of Holmes's castle remain unexplained. Quinlan had committed suicide by taking strychnine. His body was found in his bedroom with a note that read, "I couldn't sleep." Quinlan's surviving relatives claimed he had been haunted for several months and was suffering from hallucinations. The castle itself was mysteriously gutted by fire in 1895, according to a newspaper clipping from the New York Times. 2 men were seen entering the back of the building between 8 and 9 p.m. About a half an hour later, they were seen exiting the building and rapidly running away. Following several explosions, the castle went up in flames. Afterwards, the investigators found a half-empty gas can underneath the back steps of the building. The building survived the fire and remained in use until it was torn down in 1938. The site is occupied by the Inglewood branch of the United States Postal Service. In 2017, amid allegations Holmes had in fact escaped execution, Holmes's body was exhumed for testing, led by Janet Monge of the University of Pennsylvania Museum of Archaeology and Anthropology. Due to his coffin being contained in cement, his body was found not to have decomposed normally. His clothes were almost perfectly preserved, and his mustache was found to be intact. The body was positively identified by his teeth as being that of Holmes. Holmes was then reburied.